Willkommen zum Erfolgsgeschichten-Podcast, der Podcast, wo ich, Tim Sänger, spannende Persönlichkeiten über ihre Geschichte zum Erfolg interviewe. Dabei geht es auch nicht nur darum, dich durch die Geschichten zu motivieren, sondern wir sprechen über konkrete Sachen und Tipps zum Umsetzen, damit du direkt loslegen kannst, um deine eigene Erfolgsgeschichte zu schreiben. In dieser Folge spreche ich mit Admiral James Stavridis, ehemals NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Und ja, der Gute ist Amerikaner und deswegen ist dieses Interview auf Englisch. Wenn ihr nicht so gut im Englischen seid, dann kein Problem. Nächste Woche geht es ganz normal auf Deutsch weiter und schaut dann einfach da vorbei. Heute spreche ich mit ihm über Leadership und wie man denn so im amerikanischen Militär durchstarten kann. Viel Spaß! Yeah, I'm pleased to welcome the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Admiral James Stavridis. Welcome to the podcast as our first English-speaking guest.
Dankeschön. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've now used all the German I know.
Great. But we keep it in English, and I think it would be great to have a short introduction about yourself. In the interviews I saw, always you got introduced, but I think it would be interesting if you tell us who you are, what you did in the past, and what you are currently doing today.
Sure. I was born in Florida in the United States, which many of our German friends will know because it's where Disneyland is located in Orlando, Florida. And grew up in and around the ocean, and then went off to our Naval Academy, and then had a long career in the U.S. Navy, about 35 years or so, and commanded destroyers, groups of destroyers, aircraft carrier, much of it in combat, and then had two really interesting and wonderful jobs at the end of my Navy career. The first one was back to Florida, where I'd been born, to Miami, Florida, all the way down in the South. And I became what's called the commander of U.S. Southern Command, which is all military, U.S. military activity south of the United States. So focused on Central America, the Caribbean, South America. Wonderful job. I was there for about 3 years with a lot of focus on humanitarian operations, disaster relief, coming in and helping after hurricanes and earthquakes, for example, very much what we would call a soft power mission. Then change of pace, went to Europe and became Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, also Commander of U.S. European Command, so all U.S. military forces in Europe, plus Supreme Commander for, at the time, 28 nations of NATO. And during that period, which was about 4 years, my focus, Tim, was on Afghanistan, the Balkans, Syria, piracy, cybersecurity, and a number of other reforms within NATO. So a very fulfilling 4 years. After that, I finished up my military career and then turned to higher education, became the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts. It's the top school of international relations in the United States. My own PhD is in international relations and from the Fletcher School, which I received very early in my 20s while in the Navy. So it was a real joy to go back, and I did 5 years as the dean there, finished that up a couple of years ago, and now I am in the world of international business, working principally in private equity with a group known as the Carlyle Group, very large private equity company with investments all around the world. My particular focus, as you would expect, is on defense, aerospace, space operations, and cybersecurity. And then lastly, most important thing, I've been married to my beautiful wife, Laura, for over 30 years. We have 2 lovely daughters. Both of them are married to physicians here in the United States. So at least I'll have medical care my entire life and a second opinion, as we say in American English. I can compare what my 2 son-in-laws think about my health. So there's a little bit of a snapshot. And just on the totally personal side, I also love to play tennis and squash. Played them, represented my university, the Naval Academy, and played both competitively. So there's a bit about my life, Tim.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the introduction. And let's jump to the start. And what in the first place, like how did you get into the military and the Navy? What made you go there?
A terrific question and a simple answer. It was the family business, if you will. My father was a career officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. He fought in the Korean War and then in the war in Vietnam. I was always very inspired by my father, and that's what led me to go to our Naval Academy. And I initially thought I would want to be a Marine Corps officer, kind of an infantry type officer like the Bundeswehr. But I decided while I was at the Naval Academy that I truly loved the sea. And of course, coming from Florida, which is surrounded on three sides by the ocean, it was a natural choice for me. So I became a sailor. So it was initially my father's input and my family life growing up in the military. And then I refined that career choice and ultimately became a sailor at sea.
Okay. And can you give us like an example of one of your missions and deployments? So what exactly did you do?
I can. Let me quickly give you three very different ones. After a major earthquake in Haiti in the 1990s, the destroyer I was the captain of was sent to Haiti to provide medical, diplomatic assistance, disaster relief. We put our sailors ashore to try and help the Haitians recover from a natural disaster. A second mission, also in the 1990s, was off the Balkans when you'll recall there were wars in the Balkans and we needed to, NATO, ensure that there was stability in that region. So I was off the coast of the Balkans for months at a time, ensuring that arms and military supplies did not go into that very war-torn area. And then a third one in the aftermath of 9/11, I was in command of an aircraft carrier and was and the ships along with the aircraft carrier, and I was a part of the response into Afghanistan to remove the Taliban and particularly Al Qaeda, which had attacked the United States and then became part of the NATO mission there. So I suppose you could say, Tim, the different military missions I've seen and participated in run from humanitarian, medical diplomacy, that kind of soft power, to controlling a destabilized region, as I did off the Balkans, to offensive combat operations. I've seen plenty of all three.
What is there the difference between the challenges like on a soft operations like humanitarian or like on a other mission where you are more like on the hard side?
In many ways, the soft power missions are more challenging. They're more complex. When you're doing hard power missions and it's offensive activity, it tends to be pretty simple. You identify targets, you strike them. It is a very clear, simple, and of course, a very military kind of mission. When you're conducting soft power operations, on the other hand, you have to tune the instrument in a way that is more sensitive to culture, understands the history of a given region, understands the underlying socioeconomic conditions, has a wider variety of tools available. And therefore, it's more complicated when you try and apply the military to those sorts of humanitarian operations. And of course, in many situations, you have to do both. Take the example of the German deployment to Afghanistan. Germany, for many years, was in charge of operations in the north of Afghanistan, centered around a place called Mazar-e Sharif. And the Germans there had to be very capable of conducting combat operations and protecting their soldiers and conducting operations against the Taliban in support of the Afghan security forces, so hard power. But at the same time, the Germans had a soft power mission, working with education, ensuring that schools were open and were safe, participating in literacy training for the Afghan security forces and Afghan children, ensuring that medical capability was available to the civilian population. So it is entirely possible that a military unit has to conduct both hard power and soft power missions at the same time. And by the way, I will say that in my experience with the Bundeswehr and the German armed forces, they were particularly adept at moving across that spectrum between hard and soft power, very professional.
Okay. So then moving on and looking at your impressive career and what did you do that others didn't do that, got you promoted all the way up to rank of an admiral?
Well, some would say that I became an admiral due to a computer error of some kind, but taking your question seriously, and I think there's a good life lesson in all of this. First of all, I was never afraid to fail. In other words, I would try things, and everybody's success is based not on unbroken chain of everything worked out perfectly. Everybody's success in life is a result of overcoming mistakes they made. So I certainly made my share of mistakes along the way. However, I remained positive and upbeat and tried to show my superiors that I could come back when I was faced with a setback. So that is one important quality, I think, resilience. Number two is being open to other ideas, to reading, to listening, to keeping an open mind. I'm a huge reader, and in fact, I wrote a book about reading and leading. It's called The Leader's Bookshelf, and it's a collection of 50 books that I think make you a better leader. Some are biography, some are history, some are novels. It runs the spectrum. So a second quality that I think has been very helpful to me is that intellectual curiosity and having an open mind about what I read. And then third and finally, I think that something that has been successful for me is being interested in other people. In other words, I've always tried as a leader to understand the people who are on my team, to learn their stories, to find out what is important to them, and to be collegial and friendly and open. And so I think those are three aspects to how I approached my career, particularly in the Navy, which is, again, to be resilient, to be intellectually curious, and to be kind and friendly to others. That's not the prescription that everyone uses or applies, particularly in the military, but it worked for me.
Mm. And did this intellectual interest, was this also one reason you you jumped in the academic world as well and did a PhD in international relations while pursuing your career?
Yes, very much so. And the way that unfolded was I graduated from our Naval Academy and then was assigned to first to a destroyer, a relatively small ship, and then to a big ship, an aircraft carrier. And I was at sea for most of 5 years. And I was a very capable mariner. I understood my job in the military. I could certainly launch a missile, but I could not launch an idea. I did not have that kind of intellectual underpinning. And so I was at that point prepared to get out of the Navy and go back to graduate school. And I communicated that to my superiors. And they said, well, Admiral, or at the time, Lieutenant Stavridis, how about if you stay in the Navy and we will send you to graduate school? So they sent me to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And I spent 2 years taking classes, and then the Navy gave me another year to write my PhD, which was on the Law of the Sea Treaty. And in the course of those years, I developed a very strong affinity for ideas and books and writing, which I've come to enjoy greatly. And so it was a result of my Navy career and the fact that the Navy was willing to give me the time to be involved in the world of ideas. And I sailed into that world, 30 plus years ago, and I've never left.
Yeah. And yeah, that also leads like to the next step. Yeah, you wrote a lot of books, which you already said, and yeah, your new book, "Sailing True North," or in German "Segeln gen Nord," is about lessons of leadership and character from 10 of the historic most significant naval commanders. And yeah, so can you tell us a bit what you wrote there and what you learned from these people?
I can. Well, first of all, I want to just make a distinction between leadership and character, because they're kind of two different things. Leadership, think of it like a door. Leadership is a big door that swings out through the world, but that door doesn't have any moral compass. It is merely a tool. And so a great leader can be somebody like Chancellor Merkel, who I think is a great leader today, who has some successes, has some failures, but her moral compass is in the right direction. On the other hand, somebody like Pol Pot, the dictator of Cambodia, he was a very capable leader. He was able to lead his nation into a disastrous genocide through force of personality and the tools of leadership. So leadership doesn't have a moral compass. What matters when that door of leadership swings are the small hinges that door swings on. And those hinges are character. That's what's in the human heart. And so Angela Merkel is a leader who has a moral compass, and I think sails true north. She does what she thinks is right. Someone like Pol Pot of Cambodia is a cruel dictator, and his moral compass has failed. It failed him, and it failed his nation. So for me, character, that hinge upon which that door of leadership swings, is more interesting than leadership. Character is more interesting than leadership. And so what I try to do in the book, because I think it's good to write about things you actually know about. I know a lot about the sea. I know a lot about admirals. And I thought I would use some case studies based on some admirals that I knew, and kind of tell the story of character looking through the lens of a series of 10 admirals over the course of 2,500 years. So we start with an ancient Greek admiral from 2,500 years ago, and we come all the way up almost to the present day, looking at admirals like Admiral Zumwalt, Admiral Rickover, Grace Hopper, female admiral. So looking at character across that sweep of history, I think, was an extremely important part of writing the book, and that's what motivated me to do so.
And what did you learn from these people?
Well, I learned that there are a collection of qualities that define character, and I think they're incredibly important. And some of them I've mentioned already, but resilience, the ability to come back when something doesn't go your way, intellectual curiosity, someone who has an open mind and wants to learn. Um, Number three, compassion for others, a sense of kindness. Number four, we haven't talked about, and that's innovation, a desire to seek change and to be willing to try new ways of doing business. I think that's extremely important as well. And then fifth and finally an important aspect of character is our sense of justice, of doing what is right because we believe in fairness, we believe in honesty, we believe in truth. I think those are the elements of character that I saw really reflected across these various admirals, across, again, 2,500 years of history.
If we look now at today and on the current global situation, you are also, I saw some TED Talks of you on the global tensions and like global politics and geopolitics. What, in your opinion, are the current biggest risks and chances in global politics?
I think the biggest challenges that exist today in terms of geopolitics, and I'll give you three or four that we ought to be concerned about. One that is certainly on all of our minds is the pandemic. This will not be the last pandemic in human history. As you well know, the world went through another pandemic 100 years ago, the so-called Spanish flu, which actually probably began in the United States and was brought to Europe by US troops coming across the Atlantic Ocean. So pandemics and the world of biology, I think, will pose significant geopolitical challenges because the developing world, the emerging markets of sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia, will face significant challenges dealing with this pandemic and with other challenges. So I think biologically we have challenges ahead. Number two, we ought to be concerned about cyber and cybersecurity. And we ought to be thinking about how a different kind of virus, if you will, could impact the World Wide Web, could impact our individual sense of cybersecurity. And here we see nations, the United States, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Israel, many nations are developing very capable, very dangerous offensive cyber tools, which I think will be part of geopolitics going forward. So we ought to be concerned about that. Thirdly, I think we all see the ongoing instability in the Middle East, and this ought to concern us. It's a huge population. There are wars in Syria. There's extreme unrest in Yemen, in Iraq. Egypt is under immense economic pressure. Israel feels embattled. Iran is pressing into the region, trying to continue to create opportunities for themselves in the region. So that whole part of the world, the Middle East, I think ought to concern us significantly from a geopolitical perspective because of the potential to pull great powers into competition there. And then fourth and finally, we need to understand how we can manage geopolitics as China becomes stronger and more capable, which is a natural phenomena. But we need to make sure that our disagreements with China do not lead us into another Cold War like we suffered through between NATO, the United States, Europe with the Soviet Union. We need to avoid that pattern. It's counterproductive, and that is going to require a pretty deft mix of diplomacy, military deterrence, economic incentives, trade agreements. All of that will be challenging. So there are four things that I'm concerned about. Pandemics, biology, cyber, the Middle East, and China are all, I think, top of mind as I look at global geopolitics.
Yeah, and like, do you think that one of the problems which makes it harder to solve, like, for example, relations with China, is that nations don't work together that closely?
I do. And in terms of China, let's talk about that for a moment. You see China, which has a big population, obviously, most populous country in the world, although India will overtake them sometime during this decade. But China has disagreements with the West about trade and tariffs, about cyber activities, about the South China Sea and China's territorial claims to the entire South China Sea, the way Hong Kong is being treated, the treatment of Uyghurs inside of China. There are plenty of disagreements between China and the United States and many, many other countries, frankly. So what we need is dialogue. We're going to need some level of military deterrence, but we're not going to solve this one by pointing a gun at China. We're going to solve this one by creating a mix of economics, diplomacy, public communication, some level of military deterrence. All of those elements are going to be necessary if we're going to successfully ensure that China is fully integrated globally. And of course, the Chinese get a vote on this as well. And a lot will depend on how they decide to set their course and how China will decide what kind of nation it wants to be as this 21st century unfolds.
Okay, so now let's move a bit back from politics and get into today your career is in private equity at Carlyle Group. How did you get into private equity in the business? And
I finished up my 5 years as dean of the Fletcher School. Really enjoyed that. And then a good friend of mine named David Rubenstein, who's a well-known businessman and philanthropist here in the United States, came to me and said, have you thought about international business? And the case he made was that I have a lifetime of experience around the world. I deeply understand geopolitics. What I had learned as the dean at the Fletcher School, which is a very international school, was very contributory to this. And so he asked me to come aboard and essentially do 3 things at the Carlyle Group, all of which I enjoy greatly. One is to do internal geopolitical advice for the firm. So, example, should we now look to invest in Ethiopia now that the long running civil war there has ended? What is going to happen with China and the US relationship? How does that impact the decisions we make as a firm about investment? So, internal geopolitical advice. The second thing David Rubenstein asked me to do was external client-facing engagement. So, Admiral, can you fly to Paris and meet with a group of senior investors there and talk about the world and talk about the kind of investments that we're doing at Carlyle and be part of being the visible public face of the Carlyle Group? So that's kind of the second thing, external role. And then thirdly, what private equity at the end of the day is all about is making investment decisions about whether we buy a company, whether we sell a company, how do we improve that company? Do we put new people on the board of that company? Do we give it more capital, more money? And so I am also involved in individual deals that the Carlyle Group is doing in areas that you would expect. So I'm involved in cyber security deals. I'm involved in defense deals. I'm involved in our satellite ideas. So I take my expertise and translate it into the world of business. And it's a new and interesting third act in my life, and I'm enjoying it a great deal.
Yeah, that's good. And now I read that in 2016, the New York Times wrote about you that you were in talks of becoming vice president for the Clinton administration if she would have won. And is there a chance to see you in political office in the future?
Well, just to back up, in 2016, I was asked by then Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton, whether I would be willing to be vetted for vice president. What that means is, was I willing to be a candidate and be considered to come into that administration? She ultimately chose a different individual, Senator Tim Kaine, as her running mate, as the nominee for vice president. But I think had she been elected, it is likely that I would have gone into government in a senior role in her administration. After the election in 2016, I was then asked to come to Trump Tower and discuss a cabinet position in the Trump administration. And I gave that some thought, but ultimately decided that I had too many fundamental disagreements with the general policy direction of the Trump administration. So I came very close in 2016 and looked at both sides. I should mention that politically, I am what we call in the United States a registered independent. What that means is that I am neither a Republican nor a Democrat. My registration, when I register to vote, is no party affiliation. I have voted for Democrats, I've voted for Republicans, and politically I consider myself a centrist who is strong on defense and cyber and those kinds of issues, but I am center left on social issues. I'm very much in favor of women's right to choose. I'm very much in favor of racial equality. I'm very much in favor of programs to help the poor move forward. So I'm really in the political center in the United States. As I look at the way the Trump administration has unfolded, it's clear to me that my decision was correct for me personally. I could not serve in this administration, nor would I come in if there were a second Trump administration. In terms of Vice President Biden, who of course is the other candidate, I know him well. I have a great deal of respect for him, and I am certainly open to the idea of future service. At the moment, however, I'm very content in my current role in private equity, and I will let events take whatever course they will, and we'll know more after November.
Okay, yeah, that will be interesting. I will look at that. And yeah, you have, I read that you've collected over 5,000 books. How often do you read? And yeah, what was books that stand out for you?
Well, I started a love of reading when I was a small boy because we lived in Greece. I'm Greek American, and my father, as I mentioned, who was in the US military, was sent to Greece to be the naval attaché there at the embassy. And this was in the 1960s. And at the time, there was no television to watch. Greece didn't have an active television system. And so when I was a boy, instead of watching television, I became a reader. And I would go to the library and check out 10 books a week and take them home and read and read and read. And I've always loved books and loved reading. And that continued as I went along in life. And then obviously graduate school in particular opened a whole new world of reading to me. In terms of how I've ended up with 5,000 books, just over time, I I buy books, I love them, and I often go back and reread books, and they're all in one large library here in my home in Florida. Some of the authors I particularly like. Of American authors, I like Cormac McCarthy, who has written about the American West. He wrote No Country for Old Men, which is a well-known movie. He writes about the American experience in the West. I like Ernest Hemingway, who I think is well-known on both sides of the Atlantic. In terms of non-U.S. writers, I like the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood, who has written a number of marvelous books of science fiction. I particularly like the British writer Hilary Mantel, who has also written many, many books, but in particular has written a history a fictional history of the life of Henry VIII, who's one of the great characters in history. Of German writers, I enjoy Goethe, Hermann Hesse. Of the French, I like Sartre, Camus. So I have fairly international tastes. I prefer fiction about 2 to 1. Nonfiction, I enjoy many non-fictional writers, particularly historians. One I like a lot, an American historian, is Barbara Tuchman, who has written about both U.S. history and international history. Her book, The Guns of August, about the start of World War I, is quite stunning. And then finally, another American historian I like a lot is a woman named Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is someone who has written about the American history and is, I think, a marvelous writer. Perhaps her most interesting book is about Abraham Lincoln. It's called Team of Rivals, about how Lincoln put his cabinet together.
Okay, so if you can like choose one book and recommend that to our audience in terms of personal development, success, leadership, which book would it be?
Well, first of all, again, thank you for having me on to talk about Sailing True North, and I hope that that is a book that is one that can help everybody on their personal voyage. And of course, that's nonfiction. And it brings in a lot of history and a lot of the world of the oceans. But in terms of another book that I find kind of interesting to read, and I have reread it many times, is written several hundred years ago by Voltaire, and it is Candide, which is a kind of a satirical look at life, but is really full of lessons of resilience and optimism, and why those are important in how we conduct ourselves in this voyage of life that we're all embarked in.
Okay, cool. So what I also can recommend is your book, Power Dynamics at Sea, which I also read once I got introduced to you by the publisher, which is also, I think, a great book if you want to learn about that topic. And yeah.
Thank you. Just to mention that book, that's Sea Power, the history and geopolitics of the world's oceans. And instead of having people, the characters in that book are each of the world's oceans. So there's a chapter on the Atlantic, a chapter on the Mediterranean, a chapter on the Caribbean, a chapter on the Pacific, chapter on the Indian Ocean. And so much of the world's history is actually bound in the oceans. It actually comes as a result of geopolitical battles at sea and the resources we harvest and the trade routes around the world. 95% of all traded goods move on the oceans. So I wanted to write a book about the oceans themselves, and you're very kind to mention it. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, and for the audience, you can find all the links to Admiral Stavridis' books in the show notes, the description below. Make sure to check them out, and yeah, I definitely can recommend Sea Power and Sail True North. Yeah, I've read those two, but I think the other ones are great too, but I don't think they are available in German, but of course you can buy them in English as well, because yeah, we got Amazon. And yeah, coming to an end, what is your final advice for success and leadership for our audience?
I would say that great leaders and people of character have 3 tools that are incredibly important. One is communication, and that means being open and listening, as well as transmitting. Communication, we need to remember, is not a microphone. Communication is a bridge. Ideas go back and forth. So tool number 1 is being a good communicator. Tool number 2 for me is working together, teamwork, collaboration, making others feel part of your team and being a good teammate when you are on someone else's team. That sense of collaboration, of working together, I think is absolutely vital for every leader. And then third, and finally, it's innovation. It is being unafraid to try new ideas. And a key part of that, Tim, is knowing that you will fail more often than you succeed when you try something new. And therefore, many people decide it's too risky. I don't want to try something new. But I think that great leaders are those who are willing to attempt new ways of doing business, to form new alliances, to look at new technologies. So communication, collaboration, innovation. I think those are the three keys. And then finally, all that has to be on a bedrock of integrity that values the things that we cherish: democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute those values imperfectly, but they are the right values. And so I think good leaders have the kind of tools that we've talked about, but everything they do comes from their character, comes from their heart, in which is enshrined the values that make you not only a leader, but a person of character as well.
Yeah, I think these are perfectly last words to sum up this episode. Thanks for your time. It was a pleasure to have you here, Admiral James Stavridis. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön, auf Wiedersehen. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you as well, Tim.
Das war's auch schon mit dieser Folge vom Erfolgsgeschichten-Podcast. Alle angesprochenen Links findest du in den Shownotes und auf erfolgsgeschichten-podcast.de. Wenn dir die Folge gefallen hat, dann hinterlasse gerne eine Bewertung auf iTunes und Co. Wir hören uns dann in der nächsten Folge wieder und denk dran, nur durch Taten kommt man zum Erfolg. Also, legt los!